And so, without further ado, let's get started. All right, so this is our table of contents. Roz Harris on the last, I don't know if she's still here, but she was talking before. Yes, she is. She was talking before about 3 ships, and I'm going to talk about that more in a second. And that's really at the bottom, the framing of what Notes of Rest is. And so I'll talk about that as a beginning frame, say a brief word in the midst of that about mysticism and how I'm understanding that. And I'm really getting my definition from a mixture of Barbara Holmes, who's a great contemplative, Black contemplative leading thinker in the contemplative world today, but then also Reverend Michael Battle, who you might have seen before had you been on the retreat we had a couple of months ago. I see a nod from Anne. So Anne Hensley. So yes, hey Anne. So they talk about mysticism in a way that I'll then bring forth here. And then I'll talk about contemplation as I've seen it emerge in Black life. Again, really using Barbara Holmes and Howard Thurman, Dr. Barbara Holmes and Dr. Howard Thurman as guides for me there, 2 great Black contemplatives. And then also contemplation in note or in sound, which is coming from music, and talking about how I've understood contemplation emerge from my practices as a professional musician. And then there'll be a little coda where we just get to riff and talk with each other and have a grand old time. Okay, so here is a beginning, like I said, on mysticism. And this is pulling from Barbara Holmes's book, Joy Unspeakable. And so I'll be just mentioning titles throughout. Barbara Holmes's book will be one of the main sources, Joy Unspeakable. If you haven't read that, it's about contemplative practices in the Black church. Strongly recommend that. She writes, theological contemplation usually assumes the tangible reality of God's love, our shortcomings, and the inexplicable possibility of reunion. I'll keep returning to these 3 movements because they keep happening in my work, and you'll see, and hopefully you've already experienced that in Notes of Rest. Tangible reality of God's love being present in God's face to us, right? God's face to Moses and to the people of Israel as they move forth from their mess at the foothills of Mount Sinai. So theological contemplation involves that, and it assumes that. It also assumes our shortcomings. I'll talk about that a little bit too, particularly as it relates to Black folk. And what does it mean for Black folk to be aware of shortcomings? And then also this inexplicable possibility of reunion, which I love as a way to end because it also always speaks to what you often see in Black contemplative space, but then also in musical compositions in the West, namely this desire to have resolution, this desire for intimacy, and even the desire for celebration. So we'll see all of these play out in my understanding of contemplation in Black life and music. And again, this is in service to this understanding of Christian mysticism. Now, she doesn't call it Christian mysticism, but a very, very similar formula also shows up from Reverend Michael Battle, who talks and was, if you were on the Lenten retreat for Archbishop Tutu, you heard us move through these 3 movements of purgation, illumination, and then union. And really, that's ending up getting at a very similar formulation. Maybe you flip 1 and 2 here of Barbara Holmes, where for Holmes, the shortcomings, that's the awareness, right? That you're trying to purge the ways that we're not actually in alignment with God, and to be one of the first moves of mysticism for Reverend Battle and his articulation. And then this tangible reality of God's love, this presence, speaks to this illumination that he talks about. And then inexplicable possibility of reunion, number 3, is curiously the same for both. So move between those. I'm not that wedded to, the movements being all that clear. And as we well know, we've been on this journey of contemplation. Rarely does it just move simply kind of one to the next, but it can be very circular. You jump in and out. So that's a frame. That's where we're going. So here's the main idea for me. Notes of Rest emerges from my Christian practice with Black and musical forms of contemplation. What's at stake for me is creating a space for us to rest as we await and work towards the fullness of God's realm. I'll read that again slowly. Notes of Rest emerges from my Christian practice with Black and musical forms of contemplation. What's at stake for me is creating a space for us to rest as we await and work towards the fullness of God's realm. So Notes of Rest for me really is a distillation of this fusion of what I've experienced in Black contemplative life and musical. So I'll be talking through that lens, especially because we've all experienced it, but don't want to limit it just to notes. This is really speaking to this fullness of life. I start with this picture. This is a picture of a congregation. For those of y'all in Atlanta, perhaps you've seen the inside of this church. This is Cascade United Methodist Church, a church in Southwest Atlanta. This is a church that my wife and I attended. We were checking out churches when we first moved to Atlanta a couple years ago when I went to Emory, Candler School of Theology at Emory for my MDiv. My wife was at Emory for med school. This was a year we were attending this church. This picture probably isn't from that time, but we attended Cascade on a Sunday that was right around the 1-year anniversary of the Charleston massacre committed by Dylann Roof. Now, picture the scene. I am a Black Yankee. I've been called that, in case you're not from the South or don't believe that that language is used. I was called that down in New Orleans for the first time. So I'm a Black Yankee in Atlanta. First time coming down. I'd gone to Yale for undergrad in New England, and I spent the rest of my life in Chicago. Parents are from the Midwest and East Coast. So, the South was always kind of present, but always in the background a little. And yet here I am in the South, wanting to go there to study Christianity, to study the faith, to study to become a minister in the South, because I wanted to get into the nitty gritty of the Bible Belt, so-called, and we were at the buckle of the Bible Belt, that is Atlanta. And so I was there, but then, that decision was made somewhere, I think, before Dylan decided to go in and do what he did. And so here we are a year in to the reeling of the life after the massacre, and we're in this church. And I'm afraid, because if y'all recall, during that time, not only was there the shooting, but there was also a bunch of arson of Black churches that was hitting the airwaves. And so people were seeing news of churches that were going up in smoke. Now, Black communion is always at risk of death. And this is just sadly, that's something that's punctuated Black life. Doesn't mean it's always happening, but because of anti-Blackness, there's just always a risk that we take when we gather. And so I knew that. And yet when I was in this church to sing, the church was packed out like this, and we were singing the songs of Zion at the top of our lungs. And the sermon was even talking about responding to all the mayhem of the day, right? And so it's not like we were unaware. We were taking this risk, desirous to be together. And I knew that at any moment, somebody could come in and shoot us up, right? So this was just something, kind of a paranoia that probably not everybody had, because they were living there, from there. But me being from the North, the news being around, just what was going on, being a young Black man, I'm haunted by this. And yes, there was something that was happening in the moment with the music that was speaking to a deeper part of me than the paranoia. And that's what I started to take note of. This was back in 2016. Notes of Rest wouldn't emerge until 2021. And so it was in those 5 years that I started to take note of how is it and why is it that there's this sense of peace that I see in older Black folk. There's this sense of joy that I have in singing these songs in Black space. There's this sense of a restfulness that I can participate in despite the restlessness of the times. Now, that's an anachronistic statement, because now I say those terms. At the time, I wasn't talking like that. But still, I was speaking to, there's a kind of peace that these people have. I want to see what that is. And so that ended up encouraging me to start the journey. So fast forward years, I moved through my MDiv, studied theology and scripture in the arts. And as Notes of Rest got started, I realized that I sat between these three ships. So this, again, is our first stopping point for today. The ship that you see at the bottom that's kind of hazy is Noah's Ark. Now, I don't know. I think Pastor Jason, this pastor I met here recently, he was talking to me about this yesterday, and he hit me to the point that Noah's name in Hebrew literally means rest. And so a way to read it is Rest's Ark. It was just amazing, because I wasn't even thinking of that at the time. So coincidence aside, I think it's really telling that somebody, when I was explaining to them what Notes of Rest is, they said, you're building an ark. And I've been sitting with that phrase ever since. Notes of Rest is emerging from this desire to see the kind of ark that those people in the page prior, in the picture prior in Cascade, that they were seeing church, life together, this music as being. It was a way of attending to life that could happen in a closed space, a potentially safe space, while all kinds of craziness and death was around. The reality is that even though Noah was preparing for a storm that was to come, that Black life is situated within a storm that's always amongst us. And so Notes of Rest is a way of creating a space where music, scripture, and questions sit together to then invite people into a kind of restful posture, not to ultimately escape the world, to Roz's point from earlier, to numb ourselves to the world, but rather to create spaces of life, to attend to the life that's within that Sharon was talking about, right? To remember what we have within, so as to then return and see the rainbows in the world around us. That's what's at stake for me in pulling from Noah's Ark. But I don't just stay on Noah's Ark, because there's certainly a way to read some ways people talk about rest and quiet and wellness that has you actually leave the world and abdicate your responsibility to others. We know that's not contemplative outreach's aim, but sadly this can be a case, and it can feel like these practices are actually disconnected from the world around us. So I don't want that reading of Noah's Ark. And that's why I also need Jesus's ship. So what's powerful here in Jesus's ship, and we see this Ethiopian Orthodox depiction of Jesus and the disciples. The disciples are freaking out, Lord, we're dying. And I love how it's said in one of the Gospels, we are perishing. Jesus is asleep on the boat. This storm-tossed boat is one that Jesus is able to sleep on. And sleep in Scripture was always indicative of trusting God. Psalm 3, Psalm 4, I lie down in Psalm 4, it says, I lie down and sleep. I will both lie down and sleep, for you alone, Lord, make me lie down in safety. In Psalm 3, right prior, it says, I lie down and sleep, I wake again, for the Lord sustains me. I am not afraid of 10,000s of peoples who have set themselves against me all around. Right, so in the Psalter, we see that sleep is a sign of assurance, or literally resting assured in God. But then also we see here in Jesus's case directly that he's able to rest even while everybody else is freaking out. And the call to salvation, as Roz was pointing out, the call to salvation is not unique. And he wasn't mad at them for calling out for salvation. People were constantly calling out to be healed, which is the same word in Greek as the word to be saved, right? So save me, Lord, is the same as heal me, Lord. It's also the same as deliver me, Lord. So all three of these verbs that we get in English come from the same word in Greek. So to call out to Jesus as the storm is around is clearly not a problem, because it was happening all the time and he never was chastising others for calling out. The issue, I contend, is that they were calling out afraid about dying. So it was the nature of the call, the nature of the anxiety around the call for salvation that Jesus was picking up on. And in fact, in another gospel, and I think it's in Mark, the version there is he's told them that they're going to make it to the other side. And so they're crying out, they're freaking out, but he had said prior to, we're going to make it. And so it's not present in every version, but there's a version in which Jesus has already said what's going to happen, and yet and still people understandably freak out just because of what's around them. So as it relates to me, is I swim to this boat from Noah's Ark to look for, how do people like those at Cascade, how do they sleep? How do they have rest and peace in the midst of all kinds of problems? And that's not to say that we live without them, right? Dialysis, premature death, diabetes, getting shot on the street, being frisked by cops, still being at the bottom of various economic metrics in this country while others so-called rise over us. You name it, these issues are affecting Black life. And yet there's a kind of peace that can surpass understanding that can lead to sleeping on the boat, even in the midst of anti-Blackness. So then I swim to the other boat, which is to say that Jesus' peace and Noah's wherewithal to build a place where these spiritual practices can allow you to be protected against the waters that come. Those then open on to modernity. The two boats of Scripture then meet the boat of modernity for me. And as the slavers made their way westward from Europe to West Africa over to what we now call the Americas, they were bringing with them all kinds of restlessness, all kinds of chaos. And yet and still, even as people beneath the deck, now here they're above the deck, maybe getting ready to get off the boat, or maybe they just got on, or maybe they're up for one of their cleanings or whatever. But oftentimes we know they lived beneath the deck, the enslaved. Even when they were down there, and oftentimes didn't know the same language, and that was on purpose so that way they wouldn't create mutiny, they hummed. And as I learned more about that in seminary, about the hum that animated Black folk in the bottom of the ship, I realized, well, that's a hum I still hear. I hear that from old Black folk all the time. Folk be humming, humming songs, or just, sitting on the stoop or sitting on their porch or talking to you at dinner. It's a hum that's so present in Black life. And I became intrigued by that because that hum is kind of a proto song that would then come to animate us on plantations with things like the spirituals. And I wanted that kind of peace, that kind of restfulness in the midst of clearly the chaos present in a picture like this, the restlessness that's present in the actual slave ship, but then the figurative slave ships that we see now, being in the way prisons are functioning, be it in the way slavery still functions in terms of criminality, or the way we have slavery overseas and plantations that we just now make further away from American shores. So whatever it is, there's this restlessness that's present that sadly has endured through the scope of modernity. And these three ships taken together allow for a way to respond. So that's the contemplation at root for me, these three ships moving between them. And by the way, at the end, we'll have 15 minutes or so for questions. So if you have questions on this, feel free to reach out then. So those are the ships, just from my observations, my anecdotal living, and then also some study, again, around history and scripture. And now we move to contemplation, in particular in Black. So these are the 4 points that I moved through. You've heard some of this already. I'm going to speak a little bit more to each one of these, because what I'm trying to get at also is how Notes of Rest really emerges from my awareness, my contemplation, my attention to God's presence in the midst of the suffering. And so contemplation for Black folk certainly doesn't start with suffering. And Barbara Holmes makes that very clear. We've been moving in contemplative ways for a very long time. But part of the arc of Notes of Rest is to start with that lament that you see at the bottom and move towards a celebration at the end. So that's how I'm framing it here. But make no bones about it, our story does not start with slavery and it certainly doesn't end with it. Amen. So that's also very key for me. What I'm just noticing here, though, is how suffering through restlessness is something that we've seen since the garden. And so it ends up being part of what I talk about as a theological aim here in Notes of Rest. So here's a quote from Christina Sharp. She is a deep thinker. That's an understatement. She is a Black critical scholar at Tufts. She teaches English, and she wrote a book called In the Wake, which talks about how we still live in the wake of the slave ship. And what she's doing in this book is analyzing the ways that we live in the wake, the waters, literally, as they're churned about by the slave ship. And she looks at various ways that the slave ship has created all kinds of turbulence still in our life. But also, not only that kind of wake, but we live at the funeral wake, which again is to speak to Black death, the wake of a gun. So when you shoot, the coil comes back, that's considered a wake. And then also living in the wake, like being awake, being attentive to this, but then also attentive to each other. And ultimately, her book opens onto how we might care for each other by paying attention and really putting our finger on details that are missed when atrocities are described about what's happened to Black folk, and then really seeking to care for each other with artistic practices. So Notes of Rest for me is one of these ways that I'm responding to the wake of the slave ship. So here are these words from Sharp. On October 29th, 2012, on Staten Island, New York, Glenda Moore looked for and was refused shelter during Hurricane Sandy. That particular refusal resulted in the drowning deaths of her sons, Connor and Brendan, aged 2 and 4, and her condemnation by many as an unfit mother. What, they demand, was she doing out in that storm? What kind of mother was she? Not only that, but when the white man who denied her shelter was asked why he didn't open the door to that distraught Black woman who repeatedly pounded on him for help, he said that he did not see a Black woman at all, but a big Black man, and that he was forced, therefore, to spend the night with his back against the door to prevent entry and thereby his own violation. I pull out this little episode from Christina Sharp's book, and she sadly goes through all kinds of journalistic detail listing all these kinds of stories. I pull this out because Christina Sharp in this case is really pointing to how restlessness endures and is contagious. How it endures and is contagious. Glenda Moore is restless, the storm, right? There's a big old storm, and the lack of harmony in the conditions in the weather makes it then such that she needs to seek out space. But the disharmony in the weather exacerbates the disharmony between Glenda Moore as a Black woman and this white man, which then, of course, can speak to bigger disharmonies between races here. So Glenda Moore is pounding, and because of the white man being afraid of death, remember, restfulness looks like embracing death, right, which then can lead to good relations with one another. But because he's afraid of death, he ends up denying her help, which then leads to the premature and needless death of these two baby boys, Connor and Brendan. And then the death of her social reputation. What kind of mother was she? Right? So you have physical death, you have social death. And also notice here that sleeplessness is present, because as it says at the end, he was forced, because of this big Black man outside, to spend the night with his back against the door. Well, if you're spending the night with your back against the door, afraid of entry, you're not sleeping. So we see sleeplessness here. We see fear of death, clearly this distorted sense of purpose. And then we see the consequences of that, where there's premature death, needless conflict, right? Needless war that's happening. So we get 4 of the 5 parts of restfulness that I talk about in Notes of Rest. We see those right here. And Christina Sharp just goes through and systematically points to these connections throughout the wake of slavery. Suffering is something that is so present, and I saw so clearly with the Dillon Roof massacre and the wake thereof, right? And so for me, part of what I want to do is, how do I attend and help us respond, both those above the deck of the slave ship and beneath, right? How do I help us all attend to what's happening with this kind of restlessness and all the ways that it's messing us up? This white man now hasn't slept, right? And now this is his case, and maybe even he at some point feels guilty for what's happened. Maybe, right? So there's suffering there. But obviously, more to the point, there's a suffering of Glenda Moore and the needless death of her children, and all that does to rehearse for me and others that Black life is always on the brink, always on the brink. So this ends up being then one of the prompts for me for contemplation, or to use one of the questions from today: what's at stake for me in seeking God's restful presence? What's at stake for me is keeping my ever-loving mind when stuff like Staten Island breaks out, which is happening all the time. Sometimes it's reported, sometimes it's not, but it's happening in one way or another all the time in the wake of the slave ship. So that was Contemplation in Black as it pertains to suffering through restlessness. So notice how at the beginning of the retreat, I talk about restlessness, right? Enduring and contagious. And I'm doing that on purpose because it's formed by the kind of problems, the laments that I've experienced personally and have borne witness to just in terms of being connected to community. But something else that Barbara Holmes here talks about is how the spirit happens in community. So this is really ends up also then being a response. Notes of Rest, you notice how even though we're all individuals, some of us know each other, we don't know everybody here. Notice how often I was trying to point us towards one another, right? Like at the end during Wellsprings, I said, if you have a note of encouragement for somebody on this call, write that in the chat. And then you all were beautifully writing to each other, right? If you have a prayer for somebody, pray for somebody. And what I was trying to do was help us discern the state of this community, and music was a mortar by which that happened. But then also I was trying to help us tap into the life of the community that you come from. Something that Barbara Holmes makes a big point of in her book, Joy Unspeakable, is that one of the governing sensibilities for Black life, and thus Black contemplation, is that it's happening with attention to how God indwells the community. Whereas she makes a point that oftentimes in European sensibilities, we're governed by individual understandings of God being in us. African monastic traditions and contemplative traditions writ large really think about God and community. So hear these words from Holmes, Barbara Holmes. In West Africa, the flow of contemplative life is interwoven with the rhythm of talking drums, music, and bustling cities, rites of passage and a communal witness to the difficulties of post-colonial life. From childbirth to death, Spirit and flesh breathe as one. Silences and ecstatic performance erupt during ritual and daily routines. Always the practices point beyond the visible. Life is received as a gift and passed on as a legacy. I love this quote because it speaks to, again, some of the deep ancestral roots for me for where Notes of Rest would come from. These deep impulses that go before the colonial moment, right, to West African origins. And then it speaks to how this is happening in the throes of your regular life. So one of the questions I ask in the examen, I'm always trying to ask a question, no matter the group, I'm trying to ask a question about you and the daily life of your community. And that's why today I was asking, where is the restful presence helping you absorb the shocks of restlessness in your community in this season, right? In your community in this season. So some of the questions are abstract. They just maybe speak to where you are right now or some general point. But then I also try to always ground at least one of the questions in your life right now, in your community right now. So there's a communal orientation that emerges from Notes of Rest, be it about the community that we're in right now that we form for a moment as this retreat community, or be it the community you're coming from, your family, your neighborhood, etc., as I said. What you'll also notice here is that part and parcel of contemplative life in Black space is music, right? The rhythm of talking drums is the first thing that she notes. So we'll talk more about music later, but you just can't help but in Black space be singing. Somebody's singing, and that's not just peculiar to Black folk. But one difference that is important to note here is that in Black life, you can trace back to the continent, music has often, if not principally, functioned as a way of having daily communications with one another. It was obviously, in the case of slavery, a way to communicate about how we get to freedom. But before that, it was just used in rituals, washing rituals, religious rituals, just in your comings and goings. It was part of daily life. The notion of a concert, that was foreign before the meeting with Europe. Because by contrast, even though you, of course, have music in daily life in Europe, one of the main forms of music making and appreciating that emerges in Europe is the concert. And so people would have an orientation to go sit and listen to somebody or a group play. And so what happens in Black American music, and we'll get to this more later, is that you have these two meet, Europe and Africa, they're meeting. And so you have the daily life motions of Africa meeting the concert motions and the show idea from Europe. And that then leads to all the kinds of music that we know today, some of which, though, emerge from this communal life, like the spirituals. So again, I'll talk about the spirituals more later, but I wanted to give a note to that now because of how Holmes is talking about this everyday life reality of music that allows for this attention to what the spirit is doing in the life of the community. It allows for that because you're singing songs, you're coming up with songs together. This is how the spirituals emerge. They didn't emerge from one person sitting down late at night penning them. They emerged naturally in the singing. And those that rose to the top were those that were sung often. It's not like today where songs that you can put on YouTube right away or put on iTunes, those are the ones, and the ones that you have a marketing, campaign for, those are the ones that we end up listening to. These are songs that emerged because the community co-signed and said, we will sing this together. So again, contemplative life is always emerging from the community. So suffering through restlessness, the spirit and community. This third point that I've lived and experienced is the presence within. And this is a vital point as we think about all that barrages Black life consistently that says our shortcomings are bigger. Now, remember, I was saying at the beginning that Barbara Holmes says that there are three movements in mysticism: a tangible reality of God's love, our shortcomings, and then also an inexplicable desire for reunion. Those are three movements. Battle kind of switches it up. But again, we just stick with Holmes. We all have shortcomings. That ain't no secret. All of us have mess. All of us have chaos. But what ends up being unique in modernity to this anti-Black life that continually comes in all these ways is that Black shortcomings are seen as bigger than they are, bigger than they are. And they're seen even as indicative of Black inferiority. And so this is why you hear lines like, I got to work twice as hard to get, half of what a white cat has, or, my sense of beauty isn't the same as a white sense of beauty, so on and so forth. And it's because shortcomings that affect anybody. You know, I had a bad hair day. Anybody can have a bad hair day, right? But if Michelle Obama had a bad hair day, Lord have mercy, what would happen to her, right? In the ways that she'd be skewered. And so the shortcomings, the faults, the limitations, both trivial ones and also very serious ones in terms of moral character, failure, and all this, we just see how Black folk, as the adage goes, when white folk get a cold, Black folk get the flu. So the presence within is a really important point that Howard Thurman is going to help us see right now. And in his book, Deep River, where he is talking about basically a contemplative reading of the spirituals, the Negro spirituals, he writes this about the pastor talking on the plantation to enslaved folk. You are created in God's image. You are not slaves. You are not niggers. You are God's children. It is the supreme validation of the human spirit, Thurman writes. He who knows this is able to transcend the vicissitudes of life, however terrifying, and look out on the world with quiet eyes. Ugh. First off, Thurman just has a way with words. Two, this is a beautiful way of reading what was happening on plantations when the pastors, who might be enslaved themselves or maybe freedmen, but were very close to slavery one way or the other, they were coming to enslaved folk and saying that you were created in God's image, which was to always push against the ways that people were trying to deny them humanity. They were trying to say that God's not with you, right? That you are damned. And the way you're saved is to be closer to white folk. The way you're saved is to be closer to white ways of living, if you can even be saved. Thurman points to how there was a kind of Christianity that emerged that allowed people to attend to this presence within, the kind of contemplative living that emerged from the community being able to see one another. There's a beautiful scene in this book, Beloved. I'd encourage you to read it, by Toni Morrison, where folk who are enslaved just look at their hands. They're told to look at their hands, look at their feet, look at their body, and celebrate that we here are flesh. This here flesh. So that is a deep contemplative practice. It doesn't look like silence on the mountaintop. And Holmes talks about how, sadly, a lot of African practices that are communal don't get even read as communal, or sorry, don't get read as contemplative, because they don't register in the ways we've understood them from European formation. She doesn't jettison or poo-poo it. And in fact, you might notice a slide or two earlier, she's talking about quiet. And we certainly see elsewhere that Thurman talks about, being still or finding time alone. So it's not to say that European ways of talking about it are bad, but it is to speak to how there's a way, and Reverend Bello talked about this a lot, that we have hijacked contemplative living, contemplative practices, by only putting it in a European lens, whereas Holmes and Thurman speak to these ways that contemplation emerge from communal life of Black folk. I love that last phrase. Look out on the world with quiet eyes. Those quiet eyes, those are the eyes that I saw at Cascade United Methodist Church. Those are the eyes that I've seen in folk who come to me and say, play that song again. I had a session in Seattle a couple months ago, and I got done playing, and I had played this Black gospel song, and was done, had said the blessing, moved on. And then a Black woman, it was a predominantly white church, a Black woman came up to me, and she just with tears in her eyes and said, can you play more Richard Smallwood? Ooh. Now, if y'all don't know, Richard Smallwood is a very, very famous, prolific Black composer. So I had played some of his stuff during a session. So I said, sure. And I just kept playing, but I'll never forget the look in her eyes. The look. Can you just play more? He who knows this is able to transcend the vicissitudes of life, however terrifying, and look out on the world with quiet eyes. So this is some of what's at stake for me from Black life that I'm bringing into Notes of Rest, the kind of music I play, helping you see, for instance, in Wellsprings at the end, right? Helping you, just like Sharon set us up for, helping us think about the abundance that's within, pointing to that. Even if you are from a group that says there is no abundance within you, you're too poor, you're too old, you're too Black, whatever, pointing to that presence that's within each one of us. So The last move is lament into celebration. And here's a favorite picture of mine. There's going to be a picture of my um, album artwork that you saw, and then another picture. So on the right, you see a picture of, like I said, my album artwork. Somebody asked about the sparrow, and I can say more about that in a second. But on the left is a picture of my mom, who's a pastor, Reverend Adonna Davis Reid. And like I said, inheriting restfulness. Just look at her hands. Just look at that posture and just the light, even the angle of the camera. The lament that I was just talking so deeply about, so frankly about, that Black folk experience. What I love about Black preaching is how oftentimes you go from lament to celebration. I actually would say more often than not, if I hear some Black cat preaching, they may start off in the wading in the water, deep in the muck and mire, but on that early Sunday morning, the rest is history. The Lord gives us a sense of celebration, and we can celebrate because something is at stake for us in trying to find God's presence in the midst of the muck and mire of all that we've experienced. So I love this picture, and it's just, a picture's worth 1,000 words. So why have a quote for this one when you can just look at this picture of my mom resplendent, preaching on a Sunday morning. Now back to His Eyes on the Sparrow. This was done by my friend Shin Mang, who funnily enough is Korean, but he and I just have this really deep connection and have ministered together, and I'm just so thankful for him, and he really speaks into my soul, and his art's all over our home. So it was an honor to have him do this artwork for me. The reason I settled on this as the image for Rest Assured is because it speaks to this beautiful posture of really resting. You see how there is coming out of the head of the sparrow all of these arrows, all of this motion. Shin says that out of the head of the sparrow are the dreams, the hopes, the yearnings of the sparrow. And then they transform and become the food underneath. What a beautiful way to distill the good news of Jesus just into an image. That these dreams that we can have, dreams that come from attending to the abundance within, can actually then become food that sustains us for the journey. And then all of this, as we see through the nimbus, we see that God can actually see us as we seek to bring dreams, yearnings, and aspirations to God. And as Jesus says, that's the food I need. I don't need your bread, disciples. I need to eat the word of God. The will of God is going to sustain me. And so my hope is that Notes of Rest, be it in Christian space where I do it, but then also I do versions of these in non-Christian space, that wherever I am, that it gives people a way to move towards that abundance, sustaining an abundance that comes from within, right? That then leads to external fruit that you can eat, but then also, of course, others. So that's part of what's happening here. Some of this, honestly, I still don't really know all that he had to say, and that's part of the beautiful mystery that we also in contemplative circles are very comfortable embracing. So yeah, definitely enjoy that, and you can see that again on the artwork or the album cover for Rest Assured. So we've talked about Black life, and I've dibbled and dabbled and flirted a little with music. Now we're going to talk for the last remaining minutes about music itself. So the first point is all after limits. Like I said at the beginning of the retreat, part of what I want to do with the Musica Divina alongside the Lectio and the Examen is to give you a space with music that doesn't have words to draw you into this amazing awe. And to help me, I have a few thinkers that help me get there. The first is Dr. Jeremy Begbie. So Jeremy Begbie is a professor of music and theology at Duke, and he writes this great book called Theology, Music, and Time that talks about music and how music has a unique sense of time that can be illustrative of God's unique sense of time with us. One of the points that he makes early on that he builds his argument on is that a note on its own doesn't have any meaning. Intrinsically, a note doesn't say much at all. It can say that something is being sounded, but it on its own doesn't mean anything. We have to ascribe meaning to it. And this is why notes function differently than words. So I can say this, If I just said but if I 1,000 times, you'd be like, please stop. Can you just finish your sentence? Right. Because there's something that we can do with the repetition of notes that don't have one simple meaning. I love this as a foundational point for mysticism, for contemplation. We can become more aware of God's love through this awe and wonder that emerges from notes that don't have one simple meaning. And so even when I'm playing, without the words, you may not even be singing it. You may not even know that song. Now, chances are you know that song, Great is Thy Faithfulness, but you may not know it. Maybe you're just listening for how the left hand meets the right, which would be different than if I did this. Right? Those are different songs. It's the same song, but they're also different. So because notes mean so little on their own, it allows people to give the kind of meaning that they need, or just sit in the silence, sit in the mystery. There was another part of our session earlier where I just played this. Y'all remember this? What's this mean? Well, Sharon might say one thing, Maggie might say something else, Alan something completely different, and that's okay. That allows for this moment to become bigger, for you to just center down, to be still, and it allows a different kind of relationship to the words, to the questions. One time I was doing a pattern like this. I just was doing that over and over because I was at the end of the song and felt like it and felt that in the moment. As I was repeating this over and over, somebody afterwards during Banks, that middle section, they said to all of us, I was really stuck with one of your questions, but then when I heard that, something clicked. The power of that repetition. I didn't realize something was breaking open or something was clicking. I was just playing it because it sounded good, right? So there's a mystery that's present in that contemplative moment that allows for people to do all kinds of work trying to think through what is happening. What do I need to really pay attention to in this moment? This speaks again also to power of repetition. Now on the right, you'll see this funny looking picture. This is what Begbie calls metrical waves. So in music, you have bars of music, and a bar may consist of 4 notes. Now, what happens in music is that you have all of these bars that then become bigger and bigger waves. So if I keep repeating this, the third time doesn't sound like the fourth time, doesn't sound like the first time, but it's the same notes. And it becomes part of these bigger and bigger and bigger waves. Now check this out. Right? The same pattern in the right hand was leading to all of these different places that we were going to with the left hand, which would then lead to these different senses of tension. One thing that Begbie talks a lot about here, and this speaks to our mystical frame, is that repetition allows us to build up tension. Right? Am I resolved? Not really. Uh-oh. Resolution. Tension and resolution is so key to Western tonal music. And when you can create these tensions that then lead to resolutions, that then allows people to desire that sense of home, that sense of connection, that sense of peace, oneness, or we might even say union. So again, remember the 3 stages of mysticism: purgation, illumination, and union, or as Holmes puts it, the tangible reality of God's love, understanding of our shortcomings, and then also inexplicable desire for reunion. Music with the repetitions, and especially when you don't put words on it, it allows people to just feel that desire to move from tension to resolution. So I was doing that throughout with all the pieces I was playing. I would take phrases at the end and repeat them and play them up, play them faster, play lines over them to create more tension, and then also draw you towards that desire to have that union, that desire to have that peace, that stasis, that home. So Begbie was really helpful for helping me think through how music can function as a way to get people to think contemplatively about music. Now, here this passage from Holmes, who's also Barbara Holmes, Joy Unspeakable, is also helping me think through it. These artistic genres, she says, are contemplative. She's talking about jazz, hip hop, etc., because they ignite memories of the awe and wonder that we tend to discard after childhood. Art also carves pathways toward our inner aisles of spirituality. When we decide to live in our heads only, we become isolated from the God who's closer than our next breath. To subject everything to rational analysis reduces the awe to ashes. The restoration of wonder is the beginning of the inward journey toward a God who people of faith aver is always waiting in the seeker's heart. Nothing more need to be said. She's the goat, as the young folk would say. Just a beautiful, beautiful way of talking about music. So briefly, improvisation, Holmes also talks about, and I'll read again the phrase from the beginning. Joy infused with the riffs of all tends to be unspeakable. And so if I just played these songs straight, it's still, well, hopefully you think it's beautiful, but it doesn't leave much up to wondering. That's how I play if we were singing all this congregationally. When I play for services, it's closer to how I play because I'm playing in a different function. But in this case, all of that allows for this joy that is in me that emerges in these notes that don't have all kinds of meanings, chock full on them. It allows you to move in all these different ways that allows you to see and experience awe, hopefully, just as you live with this awe and wonder that, as she beautifully points out, is often discarded after childhood. I think it was Picasso who said, artists are children who've survived adulthood. And so my hope is that the playing that I do just enables us to just have that awe and wonder that is still in us, right? It's from us as kids. God's given it to us. We certainly see it when we look to the heavens and see God, and maybe you even feel it during centering prayer otherwise. But the music is critical for me in helping me think through, man, that inexplicable desire for reunion. Oh my God, God loves me. Oh my God, my shortcomings. The music, when I make mistakes, it reminds me of my shortcomings. Maybe it reminds you too. We also can feel though God's love. And last but not least, genre. I was just talking about that. And in this case, there are three genres that I use: Anglophone hymns, Black gospel, and Negro spirituals. And all of those are pointing to the life that I've lived, oftentimes the life that my listeners have lived. And it also speaks to just how contemplation emerges from the meeting of different places. And Richard Rohr talks about this a lot, just how when we're aware of the abundance within us and the abundance that's within all of us, it actually connects us to all kinds of people, right? And Reverend Battle talked about this in his time with us too, which is why contemplation in a deep sense, as Howard Thurman demonstrates, is never one that can really cordon you off from others, because silence is accessible to us all. Anybody can have an ecstatic moment. The communal life, as we saw in West Africa, is something that's emerging, and community is constantly changing, right? It's never one simple thing. So for me to put all three together, Black gospel music of the 20th and 21st centuries is not the same as Negro spirituals from the 19th century. And those sure ain't the same as Anglophone hymns from the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries. And yet, and still, all these sit together and allow us to have these moments without words that allow us to come closer to the God who loves us. So we end with the phrase again: these artistic genres are contemplative because they ignite memories of the awe and wonder that we tend to discard after childhood. And my hope is that this lecture has helped you see maybe into your childhood or just different parts of your life that awe and wonder that emerges on the other side of restlessness, as we talked about with Black folk, Black life, and also emerges as you think about music. So again, there's the overflow. I'd love to stay in touch with you, and we now have time for questions. Oh, Roz. Oh, Roz.
Hey,
she has camera.
oh my gosh, yes. No, hey, oh my gosh, this is just amazing. I don't want to have a lot of time. I'm going to go right to my question. I struggle with one to say words to why music is how I worship. So thank you for that. And I'm not a creative. Um, but I struggle sometimes listening to spiritual music when I know the words. It
Mm,
distracts me. And so I just struggle with that. And so I'm thinking about some things you talked about when you kind of did a little improv. Well, that you can't know the words to the improv because it's improv. And I remember that riff you did, that repetition you did. I finished up my little drawing. I was doing a drawing during our overflow time, and I thought I was finished. And then you did that thing. I'm like, I'm not finished. I colored in a circle. Then you kind of finished it. That resolving the resolution, like needing that tension. I was like, now it's done. So
ah,
I totally got that. But then I struggle with when I don't have you in front of me right now, and I go get some music, and I know the words to it. I'm
yeah.
like, eh. I don't know if there's a question in there, but is there a way to let it go, or is that also part of the experience? Maybe knowing the words to the song.
And that can be part of the experience. That's a great question. That can be part of the experience. And there are different versions of songs. So one thing I like to do that hasn't happened as much here, but I'm getting more into it, and sometimes I do concerts this way, is I'll just play bits and pieces of hymns, and I'll just take you down the path just long enough so you know where we are, and then oh, now we're going to a different key. Oh, we're going to a different song. So it doesn't really allow you to settle fully in one, and it allows you, as somebody put it once, to just at some point let go and just follow. So that, I mean, people maybe have written music that way. But this is also one reason I love just listening to instrumental jazz, honestly, is because there's a way that I can listen and really tap into God's face because the music isn't overdetermined with meaning, you know, and it can mean something entirely different every time. So I think that's one reason I love to play and also just love to listen. So I hear you relate, and also this is why Notes of Rest functions differently than a worship service, right? Where people would be singing songs and you very much want to be paying attention to the lyrics. This is a different way of playing even some of those same songs. So thank you. I don't know if we lost Roz, but yep.
No, no, I'm here. I think you actually gave me permission to let my. I love jazz. My first love is jazz. You've actually given me permission to let jazz do this musical divina with me. Because
Woo!
I do that with Coltrane, but I can find. Yes, jazz will do that for me.
There
It
you
takes me
go.
places.
There you go. Thank you,
Yeah.
Roz. There you go. That's it. Leslie, I see your hand.
Let me open up my space. So I wanted to say thank you, Julian, for all of this. And thank you, Roz, for your questions as well and your discussion, because I really do believe that, having grown up in a choral situation, I don't play an instrument. I've never played an instrument. So although I appreciated learning music, at an early age and listening to as my teachers took me through listening to different parts and what have you, and really listening to that part. But then you get caught up in lyrics, right? Because
Yeah.
you're in a choir, you're in the this, and, you're listening to tunes on the radio and you got to hang out with your friends and know what's happening, right? So, you forget how really beautiful um the the instrumentation is,
Mm,
right? And how much space, like I really didn't realize for I haven't realized for a long time till this discussion today, so thank you, Julian, how much space just the instrumentation
That's
has
right.
opened up for whatever. Uh, you know, I love the viola, I love the cello, I love string instruments. I know that, and I listen, but I really, you know, that was in a box, and now I can take that bigger because all of that has opened up space
Uh,
for my contemplative moment. So beautiful, beautiful. Thank you.
you're very welcome. In the handout you'll get after this from Charlie, you will get a. I talk about this a little bit. Exactly to your point, just how music is one of the places that forms us the most, and that's why it's so central
Mhm.
to me for No to Rest. It forms us the most, and yet, to your point, Leslie, we often can actually be fairly inattentive to how it forms us, be it in church or beyond. So be it Otis Redding or Greatest Thy Faithfulness. I don't care what you listen to,
Love them all. Yeah.
Exactly. And God can meet you in all. So
Hmm.
it's yeah, we're speaking the same language. Any other questions? Yep. See John. Oh, and somebody else. Nice. Yes, John.
Um, yeah, so I like what you were talking about, and what Roz was talking about is you know um, getting caught up in the words type of a thing of a familiar hymn or something like that, and that so much happens to me. Just like you read the same Bible verse all the time, you get sort of like in a rut sometimes. It's like, well, okay, this is what it is, and stuff like that. So I like how you're introducing these other genres here, and I'm able to connect with God on that because I don't have that a preconceived notion type of a thing there. So that's really wonderful. Thank you very much, Julian.
You're welcome, John. Thank you. Beautiful distillation. Exactly what we're talking about. Yep, that's it. That's it. Maggie, I see your hand.
Okay. Um, Everything that everybody said is just coming to me so clear that it's when you're in the music, you're in the present. You're
Mm,
not in some play where certain words are being said, you've memorized the words, blah blah blah. Or I love the example of forgetting the words to the hymns and trying to get into the words and all that. You
yeah.
know, it's God is a surprise. It's a surprise. It's in the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie. You preaching now. You preaching now. that's that's exactly it, yo. And as memories can be funky and funny, and
Yeah.
I was sitting once with a pastor who was talking about his research, which was in Alzheimer's. So, when people forget their
Mm,
names,
yeah.
let alone Jesus's, how do they take communion? And like this was a really interesting question for him. And so it
Hmm.
just got me again thinking about, and we know this from research galore about music and how music can instantly kind of prompt people's memories and take them back to the
Hmm.
good old days 50 years ago. Um and I think that's also the case for instrumental music, when you don't have to, there's no line that you have to remember necessarily. You can just listen and receive. So
Yeah.
thank you for that, Maggie.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Jenny, I
Thank
don't know
you.
if Jenny, I don't know if your hand was up. I think I saw it was. Yes, it was.
Um, Up till today, I never really cared much for jazz. I just couldn't get into it. I,
Yeah,
I couldn't enjoy it. Not part of the culture, not part of a venue or whatever you call it.
sure.
And so, but today you opened up those spaces, and with your explanation and your approach to it, and real in line with centering prayer and all. It's just a whole new venue. It's a whole new enlightenment, and I thank you for that. I
Oh,
can appreciate it better now.
praise God. I can go home on that, as they say. I can go home on that one. That's great. I love this music, and it's cool. The older I get, the more I understand why God would give me these twin loves, of contemplation with scripture and going to seminary and studying the languages and whatever, but then also playing and playing for a living and really playing for a living, those two going together. So thank you, Jenny. I'm glad. Yes, Sharon.
Yes. So, I forgot who said it. It's God's first language, or God's language was silence.
Mm.
And I feel like music is flavorful silence. It opens up, and I'm like, I was very intrigued by how it does provoke something in me, and really just very smoothly allows my three intelligence, just body, mind, and my head, not only head, because our words can just be in our head. And so not only bring us to the present, but there are movements. And I really appreciated that. So, yeah.
Thank you, Sharon. You see a lot. I'm just meaning you, but just the way you phrase things, I'm just thankful you see a lot. What you're saying also reminds me of a phrase from Dr. Begbie, who in his book talks about how if I just did this, if I just had constant sound, Maggie would be like, please turn that off. Jenny would be like, see, this is why I don't like jazz, and understandably, that would be so annoying, right? That's not music. If it's just constant sound, that's a drone, which, okay, that's a little different. But basically the point is, if you don't have space in between your notes, that is silence or death of a sound, Begbie argues that you don't have music. So notes of rest, the silence and the sound, they really need to be together. And you're reminding us of that, Sharon. So thank you for that. I see we're at time. I'm happy to stay, but I also want to respect people's time. This has been awesome. Just an awesome time. Okay, cool. Well then, yes, if and also by all means, feel free to reach out, julianreid.piano@gmail. Would love to continue the conversation there. And with that, I turn it back over to Alan.
Julian, thank you so much. Let me express our deep gratitude for your leadership today. We really shared a deep listening to God's presence, and we have so much of a deeper appreciation through our morning experience today of centering prayer and its role in our community and how we come together. It's been wonderful, and I thank you very much on behalf of all of us. It's been a wonderful experience and expression. Thank you so much. And thank you all, each of you, for attending with us and being a part of our community. We are here because of you, and you are because we are. And so on that, I'll say, God bless you all. God love you all. And we hope to see you again soon. Thank you again, Julian.
Thank you. Take care, everybody. Bye.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. God bless you.